This is episode 547 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by Kathleen Sgamma. She is president of the Western Energy Alliance. She's a return guest. She's been involved with the Western Energy Alliance since March of 2006. And that means that we started our respective jobs at the same exact time there, Kathleen. Kind of interesting, but welcome back to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
For having me back. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, before we get too far down the track here, talk briefly about what the Western Energy Alliance is, what it does, and just the issues that you've been working on briefly, some of the top level issues.
Sure. So Western Energy Alliance represents any company involved with the exploration and production of oil and natural gas in New Mexico and across the entire West. So we handle the producer issues, from environmental issues, federal lands issues, tribal issues, that type of thing that touch production at the well site.
Excellent. And I know, oil and gas is a big industry with, a reach globally. And if I ask you something that's outside of your wheelhouse, so to speak, please let me know. But, when you talk about this massive industry that is so impactful in all kinds of world affairs, et cetera, it's easy to get onto things that somebody who's really dealing with, drilling and land use in the Western United States that may be outside of your knowledge base. But I want to start off the conversation with just briefly, obviously a war has broken out in the Middle East, Israel specifically, which is not an oil producing state. But, I'm of an age when I remember either the oil crunch of the early 80s or have heard firsthand about the lines in the 70s and the wars in the Middle East that precipitated a real crunch when it came to energy in the United States. And, right now, as I look at my Yahoo Finance page, the price of a barrel of oil has gone down 1% this morning. So what has changed as you see it most fundamentally in global and especially U.S. energy markets? Why aren't we seeing, spiking oil prices right now? Well,
the simple answer is the American producer. We're number one in terms of oil and gas production. We are able to take up the slack when OPEC decides to cut production or when there are hiccups in the world stage. I did not mean to at all denigrate what's going on in Israel. It's absolutely a tragedy, and I'm sickened watching it. However, used to be that any kind of incident in the Middle East and our oil prices would spike globally. And because of the American producer, that doesn't happen as much as it used to do. Now, we could be doing more, however. The Committee to Unleash Prosperity estimates that the U.S. could be producing 2 to 3 million more barrels of oil a day, were it not for Biden administration policies, which are meant specifically to disadvantage the American producer. So we could be doing more if this war becomes seriously protracted and oil prices do go up. The Biden administration could, instead of running to Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, could actually take its foot off the neck of the American oil and natural gas industry, and we could produce more here. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't it be better to produce it here than ask other countries to produce it there, and we send those jobs in and all that money overseas instead of producing it here?
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate your thoughts about Israel and the attacks. Just incredibly tragic, and our thoughts are with the people of Israel for sure. But can you put some numbers on that in terms of where things were? Doesn't have to be any specific date, but just ballpark, how has the energy market changed from the days when we worried that if there was something going on in the Middle East that we would be dealing with gas lines and shortages, et cetera, versus today, especially regarding the United States production, but maybe our relative reliance or lack of reliance on Middle Eastern producers like Saudi Arabia?
Well, I don't have the data right in front of me, but we became a net exporter a few years ago. Used to be until 2015, when Congress passed in December of 2015, when Congress lifted the oil export ban. We used to not be able to export crude oil from the United States, which seems crazy because it is, I thought we were a free trade nation. But the thought was, well, we need to keep our oil here. Well, what actually we need to do is we need to produce more. We need to export to the rest of the world, because when we do that, oil is a global market. It's a global price. When we export oil, we actually keep the price, the global price of oil down. And that's the primary, the global price of oil is the fundamental, goes into what you're paying at the pump. There are other costs as well, state and federal taxes and everything, the marketing and such, distribution costs. But the primary cost of gasoline at the pump comes from the price of oil. So when we produce more in the United States and we're able to export across the globe, we keep the price down, and we keep the price down for the American consumer at the pump. So this notion that we have to keep it all here actually led to higher prices. So since 2016, when that law went into effect, we have been able to export and become a net exporter. And now we're helping to keep global prices down. Like I said, though, we could be doing more. We could take up some of that slack that OPEC decided they were going to cut production to keep prices high. We could be exporting more and take away, that couple of barrels, a million barrels of oil a day that OPEC has cut back. We could fill that gap were it not for policies here in the United States meant to suppress production.
Yeah, let's talk about those policies in a little bit of detail. And specifically, it seems like putting energy off limits is the MO of this administration. That seems to be where they really get into harsh regulation of this industry. Obviously, electric vehicles are another aspect of that, and we can talk about that for a minute too. But it seems like not a week goes by that the Biden administration isn't locking up some large tract of land from energy. Not always is that oil and gas. Specifically in Arizona, there was uranium deposits that were locked up. But talk about some of the policies. Doesn't have to be just land being locked up. It could be other things. What is the Biden administration doing to make energy more expensive for average Americans?
On that theme of locking up land from uranium mining in Arizona, they even locked up land, about 250,000 acres in northern Minnesota, from mining of the critical minerals that are needed for wind, solar, and batteries. So they talk a good game when it comes to EVs and wind and solar, but it's not in my backyard. We want it all to come from China, apparently, because they even locked away land that could be used for renewable energy. So there are policies almost every day that come out. Especially, I'm going to start with public lands because that's where the government has the most control, and that's where in the West we're just predominated by public lands. Most of the public lands are in the West. Most of your development all across the West, including in New Mexico, it's very hard to develop oil and natural gas without touching some federal lands or minerals. You can do a completely private well here and there or on state lands, but it's very difficult if you have any size project to avoid federal lands completely. Trust me, we'd love to avoid federal lands because, like I said, there's all kinds of levers that the government can pull to reduce production on federal lands. but you simply can't if you're going to develop in the West. So, for example, the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, has a rule. The public comment period just closed in late September, but this rule is, we'll call it for short, the BLM leasing rule, is meant to make it more difficult and costly to operate on federal lands. And one of the things they're trying to do is to increase bond levels so high that most small companies will not be able to operate on federal lands. And that's kind of the modus operandi of the Biden administration. Regulate small companies out of existence so that you only have a handful of large companies. And once you have only a few large companies, you can control those companies and get them to do what you want. They want, what they want them to do. And also those.
Now, let me just interrupt you real quick, because unless you're in the industry, you may not be familiar with what the bonds has to do with oil and gas. Now, as I understand it, just to clarify, you're talking about after the drill site, the drill pad is no longer being used for oil and gas. It needs to be cleaned up, and that's what the bonds then insures against, if you will, the need to clean that up. And there's been a lot of talk about, among certainly our Democrat politicians here in New Mexico about, cleaning up old drill sites, et cetera, et cetera. Is that the issue that you're referring to? And if so, can you explain maybe better than I did the process there?
Well, I think you've got the general issue quite well. So,
Right.
Most wells, when they get to the end of their useful life, which is usually 30, 40 years, something like that, they need to be properly plugged and abandoned. And that's a process whereby the well bore is filled so that nothing leaks out of it, and the well site is remediated, and then that well is considered, a completely, it's plugged and abandoned, and that's the phrase we use for a well that's been remediated. It's done. It's properly taken care of. Now, the issue of bonding is there's supposed to be a bond that is usually, it's a financial product that's meant to give some assurance that if the company were to just go away or not be responsible, then there would be funds available to clean up that well site if that company didn't do it. The thing is, though, with modern regulation, so very few well sites are ever abandoned without, or orphaned is what we call it when they're abandoned without being remediated. So few well sites are orphaned that it's really, especially when you look at federal lands, it's an issue. There are a few bad actors, but for the most part, wells are remediated by the responsible company or another company in that chain of custody. So if one company goes out of bankruptcy, another company usually acquires those assets. Even if nobody acquires the assets, there's going to be another company that was responsible that BLM turns to and says, hey, you've got to clean up this well. So that system, as it works today, with the bonding levels in place today, has been really working. And out of 89,350 wells on BLM lands, there are only 37 that are orphaned. So that's a very small percentage. And industry, most of those wells will get cleaned up by other companies who want to come into the area and develop. But so it's a very relatively small problem on BLM lands, but BLM's rule would increase bonding levels 20-fold so that it would upend the bonding market, and small companies would not be able to they just don't have access to financial markets like large companies do. So they would have to basically put down a whole lot of cash for each well, so much so that they wouldn't, a lot of small companies won't be able to operate on federal lands. So it's a principled policy that has been run by the environmental lobby for a number of years. And it's all about increasing costs so much for small companies that they cannot operate on federal lands.
Well, that is exactly what I was going to ask you, because you described very well the problem, And I was wondering, is this something that maybe just to kind of besmirch the reputation of the industry at large, or to accomplish a different specific policy goal? And you're specifically saying that it targets the small producers, which seems to be a trend here in New Mexico in particular. You hear that a lot of these new regulations that are being imposed on federal lands are really geared towards making life harder for the small producers and favoring the major multinational producers.
Right, a larger company can absorb the cost. A larger company has access to surety markets at a much better level than small companies, so they can get low bond rates. They don't have to put down that much cash for a bond because they have better access to financial markets, whereas a small company might even have to put down the full cost of that bond in cash just because they don't have access to surety markets like large companies do. Which is another policy of the Biden administration, and that is to make it very difficult for oil and natural gas to get funding through financial markets, whether it's through banks, through lending, or through capital markets. So there have been several regulations that this administration has come out with, all designed to make it, to disincentivize banks and other financial institutions from lending or raising capital for oil and natural gas.
So I want to talk in a few minutes about your recent congressional testimony, but before we get to that, of course, Deb Haaland, former Congresswoman from the New Mexico, state of New Mexico, from the Albuquerque area, now Interior Secretary. She certainly made headlines when she put the barrier around Chaco Canyon. She's got ties through her daughter to the Cuban government, all kinds of issues and problems with Deb Haaland. But can you elaborate and explain some of those issues and why she really stands out as being a true radical at the Department of Interior?
Her decision to put a buffer and stop new leasing and development around a 10-mile buffer of Chaco Cultural National Historic Park was something that she wanted to do since she was a congresswoman and possibly before. She has a duty as the Interior Secretary, though, to consult with all tribes, not just her tribe, the Laguna Pueblo, but she has the obligation to look at what was being done to the Navajo Nation. The barrier around Chaco Canyon to stop leasing will prevent about 5,000 Navajo mineral owners, so individual Navajos who own the oil and natural gas beneath that 10-mile buffer. It will prevent them from developing their oil and natural gas to the tune of about $194 million lost for their livelihoods from their oil and natural gas production. The really egregious thing, and where Deb Haaland's conflict of interest comes in, is that she did not even consider a compromise proposal from the Navajo Nation, voted on democratically by the Navajo Nation, that would have reduced that buffer to 5 miles. So a compromise, greater protection for the park, but allowing the vast majority of the individual Navajos to develop their mineral resources. She didn't even consider that, and she has an obligation to do that under the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, the thing that was particularly egregious, besides her conflict of interest being part of one of the Pueblo nations that was pushing for the 10-mile buffer, not considering the Navajo Nation's compromise, not even considering it at all, which is against her obligations as Interior Secretary. But she also has a daughter who works for the Pueblo Action Alliance, and this group has ties to Cuba, and it was pushing and lobbying her mother's organization, her mother's Interior Department, for this 10-mile buffer. So Deb Haaland had a conflict from her daughter. Her daughter's organization was also lobbying Congress about this. So can you just imagine if the Interior Secretary under Trump had a son, this is hypothetical, who was lobbying the oil and natural gas industry, and that son was, asking for whatever, open up this area for leasing, and his father had made that decision. Can you imagine the hue and cry that would have come up? It's the exact same situation. If you're the Interior Secretary, sorry, you can't have your, members of your family lobbying you. It's just quite that simple. So not only is this organization a extreme far left environmental organizations, but it literally has ties to Cuba. It has relationships with an organization in Cuba where they have exchanges to Cuba to indoctrinate young people in Cuban propaganda. And this organization even has ties to the intelligence organs of Cuba. And so we're supposed to take this all and just forget about it.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a lot of communist nations or adversarial nations, maybe China, Russia, have already been found to be supporting radical environmental groups that don't want energy to be produced here in the United States. Wouldn't be surprising to see Cuba engaged in much the same kind of effort. So very concerning stuff there. So are you ready to talk about your tangle with AOC in congressional testimony? That's something that I think is quite interesting. Of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the true leading lights of the Democratic Party in terms of seemingly their future being an extremely radical, even socialist party. And she sat on a committee that you recently testified before. So why don't you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So she is the ranking member of the House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Energy and Minerals. Don't ask me why a representative from Brooklyn, from New York City, is on a committee that deals with public lands, which there aren't any federal public lands in her district. However, she is the ranking member, and she started out a committee hearing on the BLM leasing rule, which I mentioned before. And she started out by saying that nearly a quarter of the United States' current carbon pollution comes from fossil fuel production on federal lands and waters. So I couldn't let that stand. So when it was my turn to give my 5-minute opening remarks, I simply pointed out that that was misinformation, that the U.S. Geological Survey did a study, which is the best information of greenhouse gas emissions from federal lands. And if you actually look at the numbers, fossil fuel extraction on federal lands and waters accounts for not nearly a quarter of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, but it accounts for 0.7% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So, off by just a few orders of magnitude there. The reason why it's important and why I bring it up and why it got a bit of notoriety is the idea of the left is to exaggerate the impact of oil and natural gas development. In this case, saying nearly a quarter of our emissions come from producing on federal lands. And it's to exaggerate, make it seem like it's more impactful. But if we don't develop on federal lands where, quite frankly, we produce some of the most sustainable oil and natural gas in the world from federal lands because we do it under such strict environmental controls. If we don't produce it here, we have to import it in from countries like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, who, their greenhouse gas intensity is higher than ours, and they just really don't care about strict environmental controls. So we would actually see greenhouse gas emissions go up. Now, it's this fallacy from the left that if we simply don't allow oil and natural gas to be developed, that it'll just go away. Well, there's no energy source that does everything that oil and natural gas do. So if we don't produce it here in the United States in the most sustainable way possible, then we just import it from somewhere else. So it's this fallacy of the left.
Yeah, it's unbelievable the way this administration in particular seems to be willing to do things that are harmful to the environment, to just penalize somehow the industry, not just oil and gas, but any traditional energy sources this administration seems to push back against. And would you agree with me that Biden is well to the left of even Obama when it comes to energy policy? I've made this comment before. I mean, you mentioned crude oil exports. That was something that was brought into existence during the Obama administration. But Biden, I would be hard pressed to find any pro-energy policies or statements that he has made during his time in office.
Well, the reason oil exports got passed even during the Obama administration was, the only way you can really pass something in Congress of any substance is by tying it to a must-pass piece of legislation. And I believe lifting the oil export ban was done with the National Defense Authorization Act for that year. And what happened was Democrats agreed to vote for that because there were subsidies for wind and solar also in that bill. So that's why it was passed by almost all Democrats. And we were able to get that done because of that, must-pass piece of legislation. So it was not because of anything that President Obama really wanted to do. You're correct in that President Obama, he came into office saying in 10 years, oil and gas is going to be over. Well, we know how well that went, but they definitely tried to overregulate us during the Obama administration. What we're seeing, though, with this administration is the left kind of saw, hey, we had President Obama for 8 years, but we didn't get as much done. And they have just gone so far to the left, and they're pushing such a left agenda that they are going full tilt on trying to regulate oil and gas out of existence, including through financial regulations meant to defund the industry. So we've kind of just seen the same things that were happening under the Obama administration, but the dial turned up to 11. Remains this fallacy that we're going to all be in electric vehicles in the 2030s. We're all going to just, have wind and solar by 2050. It's all going to be net zero. Well, no realistic, credible energy analysis or projection shows oil and natural gas going away by 2050. In fact, all projections show them increasing globally through 2050. And the only reason they don't go further than 2015 is most organizations don't project past 2050. So we're not going to get to net zero by 2050. It's not realistic. We don't have an alternative that does everything that oil and natural gas do. So instead of commercializing intermittent energy, we should be spending money on R&D for new sources of energy. But we're not. We're wasting a whole lot on subsidies for solutions like wind and solar and battery and EVs that are horribly expensive and not realistic, because we just can't expand the grid that fast to get to all EVs by the 2030s. It's just too hard to build things in this country because of the regulation. It's even hard to build renewables projects. And I already mentioned how they locked away lands from mineral development so we could actually create those batteries and wind and solar panels and wind turbines here in the United States.
Yeah, you're not alone in the sense that the Biden administration has specifically placed off limits, not just oil and gas supplies, but as I mentioned earlier, uranium and other minerals that could be used in quote unquote, the energy transition, as it were. But as you say, also, no matter how aggressive they are with this so-called transition, oil and gas are going to be an integral part of the energy supply. It's what, wind and solar are less than 10% of U.S. energy overall. Is that accurate? Do you have that off the top of your head, approximately where the energy comes from that we consume here in the United States?
About 70% comes from oil and natural gas. Another 10% comes from coal. About 9 to 10% comes from nuclear. And then we have various renewables, mostly hydrogen, not hydrogen, sorry, hydroelectric power, which the enviros don't want to recognize as a renewable resource, but it is. And then wind and solar provide a very small percentage of US energy, overall energy.
Yeah, that's about on par with what I believed. Really quickly, getting back to that whole issue with the Obama administration and crude exports. Our current governor, Lujan Grisham, that was a bill that was originally a standalone bill in the U.S. House. It actually passed the House with on the order of about 20 House Democrats. Lujan Grisham was in Congress at the time and voted for crude exports as a standalone bill. As you rightly pointed out, it was a ultimately passed in a much bigger bill because partially Obama said he would veto it as a standalone. But I had some level of hope that Lujan Grisham would not turn out to be complete dud when it came to energy and other policies. I hope that that was a indicator of some rationality there. I've been disabused of that notion. However, she's proven just as bad, if not worse, than I could have really imagined on a whole host of public policies. So anyway, just thought I'd relay that little historical nugget there that she voted for that as a standalone. But anything else on EVs? We're in a fight, speaking of this current governor, to push back against electric vehicles, and not electric vehicles themselves, but very aggressive mandates to implement them to the tune of 43% EVs sold by 2027. The estimate is that just under 1% of all vehicles on the road are electric vehicles. It just, do you see them as a realistic threat, or is this just the latest craze among the political classes that they're pushing electric vehicles and subsidizing them and just wasting a bunch of money for no good purpose?
Right. I mean, it's great. EVs are great if you're rich enough to afford a second vehicle that you can zip around town when you don't have to worry about taking lots of road trips with them or whatever. They're great for that. But if we were to go to some high percentage of EVs, our electrical grid would have to expand extensively in order to pick up the slack, because our electric, right now we get 97% of our transportation, and that includes air and train and truck, but we get 97% of our transportation from oil. If we were to displace even a large percentage of that, let's say 20% to the electric grid, well, our grids would have to expand quite a bit more to take that additional demand up. So there's no plan. These governors are mandating these high percentages of EVs as if the government should be telling people what they should drive. The federal government has pushed forward with tailpipe emissions and fuel economy standards that are meant to force people into EVs. Again, unrealistic goals. 67% of new sales by 2038, I believe, is the number, but don't quote me exactly on it. It's somewhere in that range. Well, we don't have the grid capacity for us. For that, the government shouldn't be mandating what type of car you drive. And so far, there hasn't been a lot of pickup on these vehicles, other than, again, if you're fairly wealthy and you want to buy a Tesla because it's a really cool car. But most of those subsidies are going to wealthy people. So you have middle class taxpayers subsidizing wealthy people to buy their Tesla is what's basically happening now.
Yeah, it's very frustrating and disturbing because yeah, electric vehicles may be a nice niche for some people with the disposable income and the opportunity to buy a second or third car, but really not at all the way we should be going. It's kind of funny though, just as a quick aside before we have to conclude here in just a few minutes. You know, it used to be mass transit was the professed alternative to you know, the vehicle and gas powered cars before electric vehicles came along. Transit has received billions and billions of dollars in subsidies and government payments, and the market share of the trains and the buses continues to plummet across the nation. So when their schemes fail, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be any mass transit, but it was definitely over invested in given the weak ridership numbers. Much better to have low income people get a vehicle that they can actually go drive independently and not have to wait around for trains and buses, et cetera. But anyway, they don't even acknowledge it. They just move on completely and kind of let the tax dollars slide there. So it's a sad state of where things go.
I just read a very interesting article yesterday. The largest EV charging station in the world is in California. It has 97 charging stations there. And it is run primarily by diesel generators.
Yep.
So even when you have your EV, it's either running on primarily natural gas or coal is your primary electrical source if you're, you know, plugging it in at home. But in these large charging stations, they often have to use diesel generators to charge those because the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine all the time.
Yep, exactly. So any last words before we let you go, Kathleen? I appreciate your time today.
No, it's just one of those things where for some reason governments, particularly the left, thinks they can tell people what to drive, how to heat their home, what they should eat, you know, that they should take mass transit, whatever. It's not what the consumer wants. And why do we think that governments know better? And when we actually look at their solutions, they're not more environmentally protective, even if the left is pushing it. So, you know, let markets decide, let people decide what they want, how they want to consume energy, and ultimately it's better for the environment.
Exactly. How can people find out about you and your organization?
We are at westernenergyalliance.org or follow us on Twitter at Western Energy One.
All right. Thanks, Kathleen. Good talking to you. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.